Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special Halloween edition of Queerantine. I'm Amy, also known as Lady Justice, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
And I'm Mitch, also known as Mr. Liberty, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
So, this week, I'm going to set my sword and my scales down.
Bye, Twitch.
That doesn't mean we're not going to be fighting, but this week we wanted to talk a little bit about something that typically tends to come up around Halloween time. And we know that a lot of people aren't going out and trick-or-treating or going to Halloween parties, but we still think that it's pertinent to talk about this.
Yeah, Halloween is a really amazing time of year because it gives everyone an opportunity to be what they want to be. Not necessarily who they want to be all the time, but it's a way to pretend and explore the things that we like about characters, about stories, about monsters even, or even the world around us. Like or dislike, that is. Because it kind of goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. So we wanted to talk this week specifically about a term that you may have heard before called gender bending. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, why we should or shouldn't use that word, and some other ways we can sort of replace that vernacular.
Yeah. So some people focus on the things that scare them at Halloween, a lot of which comes from a fear of what's different. That is definitely not a stranger to the concept of gender. But Halloween is a time where people kind of get to explore the spectrum of gender expression. So to define gender expression, that's how you portray your gender to the world at a given moment. It's mutable, it can change. It definitely can change with fashion and with time. But it's the only thing that we can tell about someone the first time we meet them. So I literally dug these out from my childhood to talk about gender. So we have the masculine side of the spectrum with Iron Man, circa 2010.
Well, and he's like the quintessential idea of what you would think when you think of like strong masculinity.
Right. On the far other end of the spectrum, we have feminine Bo Peep from the 90s, who will be a good illustration for us later when we're talking about changing presentations. And then between the two of them, we have the androgynous penguin, who doesn't really have a gender. He just kind of hangs out on my desk. And
when there's enough sunshine, he's also dancing because he's very excited about his androgyny.
And he uses he, him, his pronouns, of course, in this setting, but presents the gender expression is neutral. So yeah, that's my I don't know if that's helpful illustration of masculine, feminine, and androgyny as being kind of the middle between the two presentations. But there's all kinds of ways that people can present that don't fall right along those stark lines.
Mm-hmm. And we've said before, the only thing you can know about a person when you see them for the first time is what clothing they decided to wear that morning when they woke up. Clothing by definition is just cloth that's been like sewn together. It doesn't have a gender. What gives it a gender is what society tells about who should be wearing that and when they should be wearing that. We see a lot of crossover or a lot of costuming happening, especially during Halloween, or, you know, if you're a cosplayer and you're going to conventions, then you see a lot more often that there are people who decide to dress as characters that may not fall in line with the gender with which they identify. And so we want to talk a little bit about what that means, why that's okay, and some terminology for it.
Yeah, so the approach of gender bending has a couple different meanings. Now, this was actually a term that a lot of people identified with as being a gender bender. Some still do, because it's a daily disruption and bending of the expectations of a specific gender, the expectations to conform to their gender as assigned at birth. And so it's actually, in that context, a bigger part of somebody's identity. Examples of people who fall under the category of gender benders that have identified with that term are Prince, David Bowie, Grace Jones, Boy George, Lady Gaga, people like that who use their fashion, their gender expression, to really push the boundaries of what they're supposed to wear, not supposed to wear, etc. When we're talking about costumes, gender bending generally refers to portraying a character as a gender that is different than the one the character is identified as within the context of the media. Our coworker Jamie provided me with a ton of really awesome reading on this subject and why the terminology has kind of shifted to get away from gender bending, so I really appreciate that. I found out from one article from Comics Verse that a lot of people connect gender bending to the idea that gender expression and gender are inherently connected to sex. So why isn't that true?
So when we're talking about gender being in line with sex, what that's saying is that whatever you were assigned at birth is what your gender is. But we know that's not always the case, because there are plenty of people who have been assigned one sex at birth, but they either transition or they identify as maybe both genders or neither genders or more genders that don't exist within the scope of our society, but may exist within societies that are very culturally different from ours. So when we're linking gender to sex, that's a big problem in and of itself, because the two do not go together.
And the other thing too is that a costume that is gender bent, so going from one presentation to a presentation of another gender, doesn't necessarily indicate the person who's wearing it's gender identity. Mm-hmm. Remember that while we can observe gender expression from an outfit, like whether that's every day or at a Halloween party or anywhere in between, we don't know who that person is who's wearing it until we talk to them. Mm-hmm. So examples of gender bending have kind of come up, and I know for me this was something really positive that I explored when I was growing up, because there was almost no representation of transgender people who fell outside of the binary, who were non-binary or gender fluid or any of those identities. So the concept of taking a character who I was really attached to and portraying them in a way that pushed the boundaries of gender was super attractive. So there's a really good article that Jamie sent along from one resource that really provides questions to think about when you're thinking about doing a gender bent costume. There's 4 questions. The 5th question, of course, is this something that we do to mock trans people? Mm-hmm. And is this intended to be funny? And the important clarification is that's never okay.
Right. Well, and so you talking about how gender bending or gender bent characters was sort of really important to you when we were younger. Similarly to me, and not for the same reasons as you, of course, but similarly to me, when I had my first exposure to the idea of gender bent characters on Tumblr. Yeah. And so around that same time was when I was kind of exploring my own sort of journey, and I realized that I loved the idea of these strong male characters being given to females and being portrayed by females, because typically those females were also coded as lesbian or bisexual. Mm-hmm. And so for someone who was also sort of trying to figure out where in their path they were and, what was important to her, seeing these characters that were so impressive to me, that were people that I really looked up to as characters, and having the idea of them existing as women, but also as same-sex attracted women, was huge to me, because it sort of gave me a different form of idols that I could look up to, because at that time there wasn't a ton of media representation.
Yeah, and so you're seeking out that representation.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the most amazing things about creatives, is that where it hasn't existed, we've made our own. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people who were on Tumblr with us in those Tumblr days have become professional creators creating their own new media. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons we see more representation now, which I think is super, super cool. So those questions for thought from Ambit were, what is the intended effect of your costume? While it may feel funny, for example, to wear a dress or put on a beard with the intent of shocking your friends and making them laugh, what that actually ends up doing is sending a very clear message that people who look or dress that way are supposed to be mocked or ridiculed. this is something super pervasive in our culture that really affects assigned male at birth, gender nonconforming, and transgender folks. That is really dangerous and unhealthy and not something that we should continue to perpetuate. At my high school, we actually had an annual tradition as part of Spirit Week and our pep rally that we would have what was called male cheerleading.
Yep, we had that too.
Yep, where the boys in the class would purposely dress as women to mock that experience. It was very, like, degrading, and everyone just thought it was the funniest thing, and it always left me with a knot in my stomach watching that growing up. And it wasn't until I was much older that I figured out why, and looking back on it, I'm horrified that that was something that was allowed to happen. But that's what a lot of people do at Halloween too, is they decide, like, oh, this is funny, this is something I'm going to do as a joke.
Well, and we saw that a lot at my school too, because it would, during Spirit Week or Pep Rally Week or whatever you wanted to call it, the day that the men would wear I went to a Catholic school, we wore kilts. So the day that the men would dress up in the knee socks and the kilts, the females' uniform, the girls would play powder puff, which was football, basically, tag football, flag football. I don't play sports. But it would be flag football, I believe, is when you've got the little belt and you rip the flag off. And so women were taking on coded male behavior and men were taking on the coded female behavior. And I think my school really did it in a way where they didn't allow for it to become a mockery. But it's really interesting now being able to see it through the lens of, like, oh, like, it was men and women just, like, flipping the switch and trading off with each other for the day. And it's really interesting to look at it through that lens now.
It's definitely important to be able to explore gender and to cross those lines in a way that's respectful. I think that's something that everybody deserves to have that experience. And I love that even at your school, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't something that was mocking. It was just, let's switch roles for a day.
And it was like the boys were being big goofballs and the girls were like, sweet, we finally get to compete.
Yeah. I just imagine, I know for myself, it would have been, why can't it be like this all year? So it's nice that it wasn't a joke, but for it to be just like a once a year thing too, like, kind of ends up reinforcing those codes, right, in the end, which I know now we're trying to get more away from. The second question in regards to a costume is, are you playing with gender or are you simply trying to sexualize a character? Because that's something that's also really prevalent, where women are expected to wear skin-tight revealing clothing. So a character who was male would be portrayed more along the, like, specifically if we're talking about comic book heroes, right? Kind of flipping that switch and making it automatically go to that far other side of the spectrum, which again reflects really dangerous ideas about transgender people.
It's so interesting to hear us, like, discussing typical costumes out loud, because I have vivid memories. I have vivid memories of one Halloween I dressed up as Johnny Damon, who was then playing for the Boston Red Sox. And I think it was in 8th grade, because I had my softball pants. So I dressed up as Johnny Damon, and I didn't think anything of it. I was just like, wouldn't this be a super cool costume? They just won the World Series, like. And so I dressed up as Johnny Damon, and I didn't even, like, think about the fact that I was dressing as a boy. I was Johnny Damon. And it's really interesting to think about this now, because you're right, like, historically, even as children, costumes for women and costumes for men are so different, and little girls are always put in their little leotards and their tutus and their princess dresses, which is great and fine, but it sets people on their track very early on, and I am forever grateful to my parents for always, like, they're like, you want to be a witch for the 7th year in a row? All right, like, this is why we kept this hat, because they were very much like, do what you want to be Johnny Damon for a year, okay. And I love that, because I know my sister also went as a baseball player one year, and we never really thought of costumes in the lens of gender. We just thought of what would be fun
This would
to
be fun to wear, yeah, because that's what
Yeah.
kids do. And letting kids make those choices for themselves is so important. I would never dream of talking down a princess dress. Oh my goodness. I am the
Never.
most Cinderella focused boy. I talk about Cinderella all the time. My master bedroom is Cinderella themed.
Well, and there is nothing more heartwarming than seeing a little princess toddle up to your front step to get candy.
Right, yeah. Something that I did notice when I was looking at examples of what people were calling gender bent costumes was there was this one little girl who loved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but she also loved tutus. So she was dressed as Leonardo, but with a tutu, because the mom said, I couldn't find any girls, like, feminine TMNT inspired costumes that were not much older than my child is. And that's really true too.
Yeah.
Is that as girls grow up, there is like that unhealthy kind of shift. And so I say reclaim Halloween
Absolutely.
if I have anything to do with it.
Justice and liberty coming in hot.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so inherently making it something that's really revealing when you're playing with gender, or like pushing assumptions made of the other gender onto the character, is really harmful. It also kind of shows that, like, transitioning from a gender identity to a new gender identity that better fits who you are is something that you do in trying to seek out a partner, not something about who you are. And it also can be seen as like referencing trickery or deception. That idea of like trying to trick people into thinking you're the other gender when you're not.
Well, and that's a huge problem and a huge myth and stereotype that we see all the time in the LGBTQ community is that, we call it, stealth. So people can kind of fly under the radar, but then they get accused of tricking people or sneaking around or, sort of hiding something and then dropping this bomb on somebody else when literally all you're doing is just being yourself. And so that's a really important thing to bring up because that ties in so greatly to everyday realities for people in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, like a trans person who is stealth is doing so because they don't want to publicly declare this very private part of their past and their identity, and that's perfectly okay. Everyone's entitled to that privacy. That doesn't mean they're deceiving anyone or tricking anybody.
Absolutely.
Trans women especially get hit
Yes.
with that line of thinking, and it can be very dangerous for them, and it's not ever okay. The third question is, what is your process for playing with gender? So, like we were talking about with gender expression, there are so many ways for gender to be expressed, even within masculine, feminine, androgynous. So, like if we're talking about my 90s Bo Peep, right? Like she had this very traditional southern hoop skirt, she had the bonnet, she had her sheep, and it was all very domestic, docile, the way that the character was originally designed. But have you seen Toy Story 4?
I haven't seen Toy Story 3.
Oh my goodness. Amy just needs like a month-long movie marathon with me.
I am
Excuse
so
her.
bad at watching movies. It is like the bane of Mitch's existence.
It does drive me a little nuts, but it's okay because I love and appreciate you for who you are and our
Thank
diverse
you.
interests.
I can tell you all about The Office.
Oh, that's good. But, so a little bit of a spoiler here, but in the fourth Toy Story, Bo Peep and Woody get separated when Woody's mom gives away the Bo Peep lamp in the beginning of the movie. But then we run into Bo Peep again because she had ended up going to an antique store and she kind of like went rogue and broke loose from the antique store, and now she's like doing all this mixed martial arts moves. She's swapped into like a romper pantsuit kind of deal.
It's like the Barbie secret agent.
A little bit. Well, and
love
she and
that.
her sheep are now going on all these adventures and doing all this cool stuff, and she's so excited because she's traveling and she's seeing the world, and she and Woody reconnect, and that's a really lovely hetero storyline. But the point is that Bo Peep has become more liberated, more empowered. She's not connected to this super feminine presentation that she used to have, and that's okay, right? Like she grew, she it's literal character development in that case. She's still Bo Peep. She's still a girl. She identifies as a girl. She's just now a girl who's off on adventures. It doesn't mean that she's not who she says she is.
And that doesn't mean she doesn't have the option to be feminine when she's not off on adventures.
Right, exactly. And that's totally true. So, when you're expressing gender, it's not necessary. If you do want to take a character and portray them as another gender, you don't have to buy into the stereotypes of that other gender. There are so many different ways to be. I dressed up as Iron Man in high school, and I definitely didn't do a very traditional masculine Iron Man. I had the mask, I had everything. I don't know why you're surprised.
I don't know if I'm surprised or if I'm just trying to picture little tiny Mitch as Iron Man.
I guarantee you that one of my high school friends has pictures.
I'm going to need you to find that for me.
We'll have to look into that. The fourth question is, what are you trying to say about gender when you're making these choices? So really thinking critically, does the message of the character change because of the way you portray the character? And how can you subvert those expectations of gender norms rather than reinforcing stereotypes and assumptions? Mm-hmm. So an example that I give a lot, I know that we talked about this, when my niece was little, she was Batman for Halloween. And she was Batman. She wasn't Batman as a woman. She was Batman because that was the costume, just like you were Johnny Damon.
That's right.
Oh, I remember.
Except for the year afterward when he traded to the New York Yankees, and I was Johnny Damon, but I crossed his name out and I wrote Trader on the back of my t-shirt because Red Sox do not trade to Yankees.
That's... wow. I bet you my grandfather was very angry. I don't remember that. But I bet you my grandfather
It was a bad time in the Red Sox land.
I bet. But, like, so you are not inherently changing the message of the character when you are changing the presentation of the character, right? Like, you certainly wouldn't take somebody who is super outgoing and suddenly portray them as shy and call them the same name, I guess, is kind of the point. Like, there's still facets of who the character is and facets of that like carry over no matter what the gender presentation is. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to change that for them to be aligned with whatever gender they're being portrayed as.
Right. So something important to remember when we're talking about gender bending and when we're using that terminology is that not everybody receives that terminology well. So we always talk about impact versus intent. If you're going into it with the best of intentions and you're, doing all these things we've already talked about, that's great. Where it becomes kind of a hot button topic for some people is that gender bending sort of makes it rely on still giving in to stereotypical gender roles. So, like we were just talking about, so if we gender bent Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean, it would be a female pirate, but if you're gender bending Jack Sparrow, typically Jack Sparrow's new costume would be a very tight-fitting shirt. It'd be a very feminine figure, and the mannerisms would be very feminine. So when we're talking about gender bending, we just want to make sure that we're not still giving rise to those stereotypical and sometimes harmful gender binaries, because it's not necessarily about the gender binary. Sometimes it's about existing as a character that really isn't rooted in gender. And so we're not saying, when we're saying we're gender bending, we're not placing the expectation on being fully feminine, switching over to fully masculine, or vice versa. There's always room for fluidity, and there's always room for it to not just be staunchly one or the other. And so that's something that does come up. So when we're using that terminology, it's important to remember that some people don't like that term for the fact that it sometimes does drive home harmful binary stereotypes.
Yeah, specifically speaking to that, Jamie sent an article by Riley J. Davis, who wrote for Twin Cities Geek about...
Is that your dog?
That is not my dog. That is a different Riley. He wrote about his fear as a trans man who cosplays, that his cosplays would be seen as gender bent when they aren't. And so, that's what really got me thinking about my niece as Batman, even though she identified as female. It was a male cosplay. And it made me think of me as Iron Man, even though I was in the middle of transitioning. I was still Iron Man. So the real super simple solution that you would hope would dawn on us sooner than it does sometimes, that Riley shared, is to ask. So if you see somebody at a con or out on Halloween and you love their costume, don't take pictures of other people without their consent. Ask what their pronouns are for their look. That's a perfectly okay thing to do. It may feel awkward, it may feel clunky, but I'm sure that people would rather be asked than told.
And how many times have you talked to a little kid and you've been like, okay, Tommy, time to come inside, and they're like, I'm not Tommy, I'm Jack Sparrow. I don't know why Jack Sparrow's my example for everything today. But, when kids are playing around and they're like, I'm this person, and you call them by their real name or you use their pronouns, they're like, that's not who I am. So it makes a lot of sense to sort of carry that idea over to, talking with older youth or adults who are cosplaying and being like, oh, okay, I see that you're this person today. Like, do you want me to use this name? And since you're this person, or do you want me to use this character's pronouns? Because it does feel kind of silly, but like, if you're putting the time in to get ready and be dressed up like that person, like, I personally would be like, yeah, call me that person's name. Like,
It definitely depends on the individual. A great tip that my dad gave me when I first started working with youth, because my first real long-term work with youth was teaching art. My dad taught me the $1 million sentence of, tell me about your drawing. Instead of going, oh, that's a nice potato, or I really enjoy your portrayal of the Eiffel Tower, and making an assumption about what's in front of you, tell me about your drawing. So we're not all walking pop culture encyclopedias, certainly not when we're playing with gender the way we are. Or, when we're talking to any kid or adult, tell me about your costume is a perfectly reasonable sentence, and it doesn't even bring in the gender conversation. But people who want to have that conversation and want to share that with you have an opening too, because you said that. So, and then too, if they do let you take their picture and you want to share it on social media, check with them about what tags they're comfortable with you using. Me dressed as Mr. Liberty, I would want you to tag me as Mr. Liberty and not Lady Liberty, because I'm Mr. Liberty. There's a beard under this mask, you just can't see it.
Yeah, so when it really comes down to it, costumes and cosplaying are very similar to your gender expression, where it's what you know about that person is how they've dressed for the day, right? So when we're talking about the idea of gender bending, or when we're talking about opening the space to give the person who's dressed that way the opportunity to speak with you about that, at the end of the day, it's all about how they've decided to express. And we always say that people will tell you what their reality is, and your responsibility is just to respect that and reflect it back.
And that's also true on Halloween.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So definitely, I know Halloween looks very different this year. I'm really excited to have found out that Paranorman is on Netflix, which is an awesome kid-friendly Halloween movie that includes one of the first ever gay characters in a mainstream movie release.
I'll be watching that because I can't watch scary movies.
Yeah, I know.
And I've yet to see Paranorman.
It's very cute. You'll like it.
I'll probably cry. I cry at everything.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a crier. But it's a good one. It's a good movie. And then Cameron and I decided to do a vintage 90s inspired Halloween. We're doing the 7-layer taco dip with the sour cream spider web, and we're going to do mummy hot dogs, the vintage 90s Halloween fair.
I love that you're doing the 90s Halloween fair, and I feel like I should bring my pets on a walk by your place, because I'm dressing my pets up as Beanie Babies. And they've really hit their stride in the 90s. My sister helped me create 4 very cute poems, one for each of my animals. So, Wonder Twin brain strikes again.
Yeah, absolutely. There we are on the same page as always. Riley is a sunflower, and I will be wearing a flannel and carrying a shovel in my pocket for the day because I'll just be the gardener. We're going easy because we're not going anywhere. But I hope that everyone has a happy Halloween.
Stay safe. Follow CDC recommendations if you are going out in groups, if you're going out trick-or-treating. Please wear your masks. Make sure that you're putting distance between you and other people. It's unfortunate, but it has to happen. That's why even Liberty and Justice can't get away with not following CDC recommendations.
We believe in setting a positive example, and everybody that we contact through this matters to us, and your safety matters to us. Mm-hmm. And that is why we please ask that you just play it safe this weekend.
Absolutely. And if you have any ideas of really cool costumes you have had in the past, or things that you're hoping to dress up as either this Halloween or next Halloween, because I know people are already making plans for the things they've had to miss this year, let us know. We'll be in the comments.
A great time to work on cosplay, I have to say. When I got married, my suit was actually made for me by a cosplayer who was in down season because cons weren't happening, and it was awesome. It was perfect. So definitely support your local cosplayers.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the meantime, have a happy Halloween and stay safe, and we'll be back next week.
Bye.
Bye.